All right, so metal box. Right. Doesn't exactly scream world-changing, does it?
Not at first glance, no.
But then you crack open a book like The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller.
By Mark Levinson.
Right, by Mark Levinson. And it kind of hits you this unassuming thing. It really rerouted the entire planet in ways that most of those flashy inventions, the ones that get all the attention, could only dream of doing.
It's true. And actually, this ties in perfectly with what one of our listeners asked about recently. They were curious about how, cheaper shipping costs really played into the whole story of globalization.
And that's where the shipping container comes in, right?
Absolutely. It's like ground zero for that whole phenomenon. It's not just about the logistics of moving stuff around. It's really the hidden engine behind how interconnected our world became.
And Levinson's book, it really does a fantastic job of laying bare just how pivotal this seemingly humble container has been to everything. I mean, apparently even he was taken aback by the reaction to his work.
Yeah, he was.
It really underscores how this object's impact was, and I think in a lot of ways still is, just underestimated. I think outside of maybe specific industries like labor.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, right? Because there was surprisingly little academic work that really delved into the broader consequences of the shipping container before the box came out.
Yeah, it's almost like it was hiding in plain sight.
Exactly.
So, that really sets the stage for our deep dive today. We want to try and understand how this thing, this metal box, managed to slash the cost of moving goods around the world so dramatically, and how that, in turn, fueled the globalization that we all experience every day.
Sounds good.
So let's rewind the clock a bit. Imagine a world before containers. Shipping back then was this chaotic, just utter mess of what they call break bulk cargo. Levinson paints a very vivid picture in the book.
Yeah.
You've got longshoremen on the docks, backs breaking, using hooks and sheer muscle to move all sorts of different goods.
It was unbelievably inefficient. You can picture trying to fit everything in a ship, and you've got, say, 100-kilo bags of sugar right next to these massive, 2-ton steel coils.
Wow.
I mean, how do you even begin to efficiently load and unload that jumble?
It's like a real-life game of Tetris gone wrong.
Exactly. And the book really highlights just the sheer variety of goods that were being shipped. Bananas, coffee, cement, copper, you name it. And each of those things required its own specialized and usually very physical handling method.
Yeah, it was backbreaking work. And it wasn't just the physical toll on the longshoremen, right? It was also the incredible amount of time that this whole process wasted. They did this study of a ship called the SS Warrior, and the results are pretty mind-boggling. It turned out that a typical cargo ship back then spent something like half of its entire voyage just sitting in port.
Just sitting there.
Yeah, just waiting to be loaded and unloaded. And get this, that same ship, the Warrior, was carrying almost 200,000 individual pieces of cargo.
Oh, wow.
Think about the paperwork involved in that.
Oh, yeah. Each item had to be handled individually, documented, loaded, secured, and then, of course, unloaded and sorted at its destination. It was a logistical nightmare.
It was. And that's why the ports back then were these massive bottlenecks, really slowing down the entire flow of global trade and just driving up expenses.
Yeah. And to no one's surprise, I guess, there was a transportation study from way back when that pretty much suggested that packaging cargo in some way, in some organized way, to avoid this whole break bulk mess was going to be absolutely key to making things more efficient.
And there were some early experiments going on, right? Like those roll-on, roll-off ships that they were trying out after the war. And of course, the military had those Connex boxes, which were sort of a precursor to the modern shipping container.
Right. Those were definitely steps in the right direction. But they weren't quite the full leap forward that was needed.
No, not yet. And that's where Malcolm McLean enters the scene. Now, he was a guy who came from the trucking industry. So he was very, very familiar with all the headaches involved in transferring goods between trucks and ships.
And he wasn't afraid to try new things.
Oh, absolutely not. And you know what? He had this moment, this sort of aha moment.
You mean the container?
Exactly. He had this vision of essentially using those truck trailer bodies themselves as standardized shipping units, just lifting them straight off the trucks and onto the ships.
Yeah, it sounds so simple in retrospect, but at the time, it was revolutionary.
It was. And it's really interesting to look back at his track record with McLean Trucking, even before containers came along. It's clear that this guy was obsessed with cutting costs and improving efficiency.
I was just reading about that. He did all sorts of things, automated terminals, switching his fleet to those more efficient diesel engines, negotiating better deals on fuel, even investing in management training.
Wow.
Yeah, he was always looking for an edge, you know?
He was. And then he makes this really audacious move. He buys a shipping company, Pan Atlantic, which later became Sealand. And that was a pretty strategic move, right? I mean, it was basically a way to get around all the regulations that might have prevented a trucking firm from owning a shipping line.
It was a risky move, for sure. I mean, he essentially pivoted away from the entire business he'd built to chase this unproven idea of container shipping.
A huge gamble.
It was. And, you know, it wasn't all smooth sailing from there. I mean, he faced a lot of pushback. Imagine trying to convince people back then that stacking these giant metal boxes on ships was actually safe, that was practical. It was a hard sell.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, he had to jump through all these hoops, get approvals, and actually prove that it could be done. And then there was the whole issue of the equipment. They needed entirely new equipment to handle these containers, like those massive rotating cranes that we see in ports today, and that crucial spreader bar, which was invented by a guy named Tantlinger. Those weren't just things you could buy off the shelf.
No, they had to invent it all. And they had to figure out how to transform those standard C2 cargo ships. Those are the real workhorses of the sea back then.
Yeah.
And they had to transform them to efficiently carry these containers.
It was a huge engineering challenge. I mean, they had to widen the decks, enlarge the hatches.
You had to come up with those cell guides inside the ships, those vertical steel slots that keep the containers from shifting around. It is a massive undertaking.
It was. And Tantlinger actually went so far as to build this full-scale 20-foot-high model of a ship's hold.
Really?
Yeah. So he could test the stresses on a ship that was rocking at sea. He wanted to make sure those containers wouldn't budge.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
You know, and then there's this one invention that often gets overlooked, but it's so crucial to the whole system. The twist lock.
Oh, yeah.
That little mechanism that fits into the corner castings of every container is what makes secure stacking possible.
It's like the unsung hero that holds the entire container shipping world together.
Totally. And it's interesting, isn't it, to see how different companies tackled those early operational questions. You know, Sealand, McLean's company, they decided to equip their ships with cranes.
Right, which gave them a lot more flexibility, right? They could dock at all sorts of different ports, even the ones that didn't have that specialized infrastructure for handling containers.
Exactly. Whereas Matson, another big player at the time, they went all in on land-based cranes, focusing on efficiency at a smaller number of major hubs. So two very different approaches right from the start.
And all this while, you know, McLean is pushing the envelope, but the established maritime world is pretty skeptical, to say the least.
Right. They're like, what is this guy doing?
Yeah, many of them saw containers as like a niche solution. Maybe okay for short coastal routes, but not really suitable for the complexities of, you know, truly global trade.
And you know, there were some cautionary tales, weren't there? Like Graceline, for instance. They invested heavily in containerization, but they faced really fierce labor opposition, and ultimately it didn't work out for them.
Yeah, that was a real setback for the industry.
It was. And even Sealand, McLean's own company, they had some early stumbles. You know, their service to Puerto Rico, it wasn't an instant success.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they actually racked up some pretty substantial financial losses in the late 50s. And initially, you know, trying to convince those big manufacturers to switch to containers was a tough sell.
I can imagine. It was a whole new way of doing things.
It was.
Yeah.
Although they did start to get some early traction with some food companies and pharmaceutical companies.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But McLean, this guy was incredibly determined. He just kept pushing forward. He even started taking existing tankers and like supersizing them. They called it jumboizing.
So they were basically just increasing the container carrying capacity of these ships.
Exactly. It was another one of those bold, aggressive moves.
Yeah.
He was constantly pushing the limits, even when he was facing all this financial pressure.
And of course, we can't talk about the rise of the container without talking about its impact on labor, especially on those longshoremen who were, you know, doing all that backbreaking work on the docks.
Yeah.
Because suddenly the jobs that they'd been doing for generations, these manual jobs, were being replaced by machines.
By this new system.
Exactly. So naturally, there was a lot of resistance.
And a lot of fear, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. And it led to some pretty intense union opposition. And I think the most notable example of this was in the Port of New York, where the International Longshoremen's Association, or the ILA, They fought really hard against containerization.
They did.
It led to some very difficult negotiations and eventually to agreements like the guaranteed annual income, which was an attempt to try and cushion the blow of those job losses.
Soften the impact.
Exactly. And the situation on the Pacific Coast with their mechanization and modernization agreement, it unfolded a little differently, but it was still a very contentious issue.
It was a huge shift. And then on top of all of that, you have this surprisingly complex issue of standardization, which, you'd think a container is a container. It's just a box, right?
Right.
But in the early days, everybody had their own idea about what the perfect size for a container should be.
It's kind of funny when you think about it.
It is. I mean, Pan Atlantic, McLean's company, they were using 35-foot containers.
Yeah.
Matson went with 24-footers. Graceline was using 17-foot containers. I mean, it was a complete logistical headache waiting to happen.
It's like trying to build a global system using incompatible Lego bricks.
Exactly. And, each shipping line had their own reasons for choosing the size they did. Often it was tied to their existing infrastructure or the types of goods that they were used to shipping. But it was a mess. And eventually the American Standards Association, they stepped in and through their MH5 committee, along with a lot of work by a guy named Les Harlander, they really spearheaded the effort to hammer out some common dimensions for these containers.
So they were trying to get everyone on the same page.
They were. But it was a real tug of war, because different companies had different interests and they were all pulling in different directions.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it took a combination of industry agreement and a little bit of government leverage to really solidify those standards.
Leverage.
Yeah, the government basically started linking those crucial ship construction subsidies to the adoption of the now familiar 10, 20, 30, and 40-foot lengths.
Ah, I see. So if you wanted those subsidies, you had to play by the rules.
Exactly.
Oh, yes.
And that really helped to tip the scales in favor of standardization. But, even after that, there were still some hurdles, like standardizing those corner fittings, for example. That was another challenge that the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, eventually had to step in and help resolve.
It's amazing how much work went into just getting everyone to agree on what a container should look like.
It is. But it was absolutely crucial. I mean, this seemingly mundane agreement on dimensions, it actually unlocked these exponential efficiencies. It saved the industry untold billions of dollars by creating this truly interoperable global logistics network.
And once those key battles over labor and that really crucial standardization started to get resolved, that's when we really saw globalization take off.
Yeah. And the container, it really acted as the primary catalyst for those dramatically reduced shipping costs.
It did. And I think one of the big turning points was McLean's gamble on the transatlantic trade. Once he proved that container shipping across the Atlantic was viable, that it was cost-effective, the European shipping lines, they basically had no choice but to get on board or risk being left behind.
They had to adapt.
They did, and the boom in the Pacific was even faster, I think. Matson's initial service to Japan, that was quickly followed by Sealand and those Japanese exporters, they embraced containerization with incredible speed.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the value of Japanese exports to the U.S. saw a massive jump almost overnight, and that was directly linked to the efficiency in those lower costs that containers provided.
Wow.
But, there's always a flip side to these things. This rapid adoption of containers, it actually led to a period of overcapacity in the shipping industry.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, all of a sudden, you had all these new, bigger container ships coming online. And that meant there was more space on ships than there was cargo to fill it. So what happened? Well, unlike in the old break bulk days where ships would just sit idle if they couldn't fill their holds, container shipping lines, they started aggressively cutting freight rates to try and attract more cargo.
So they're kind of like airlines constantly trying to fill empty seats.
Exactly. The more competition there was, the more empty slots there were on ships, the lower the price of shipping got. And this, of course, drove down shipping costs even further, which made international trade even more attractive.
It's a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle.
It is. And then you have the rise of those independent carriers, companies like Maersk and Evergreen, which really poured fuel on this fire.
Oh, so?
Well, they weren't part of those traditional shipping cartels that had controlled the industry for so long, so they could offer significantly lower rates, which put huge pressure on those established players to lower their prices as well.
So more competition, lower prices.
Exactly. And then we can't forget about the impact of deregulation in the U.S., especially in the trucking and railroad industries.
Right.
Because that made intermodal transportation, the seamless movement of containers between between ships, trains, and trucks much more efficient and, of course, less expensive.
And the fact that railroads and shippers could now negotiate long-term contracts, that really helped them optimize their entire logistics chains, didn't it?
It did. It was a game changer in terms of reducing overall costs.
And it's this dramatic reduction in shipping costs. And the fact that those costs became so much more predictable that really reshaped global supply chains in a fundamental way.
Because all of a sudden, manufacturers weren't tied to local suppliers or local production anymore.
The world was their oyster.
Exactly. We saw this huge shift away from what's called vertical integration, where one company controlled every step of making a product, to this new model of disintegrated production.
Okay.
So companies could source components from all over the globe, assemble products in the most cost-effective locations, and then ship those finished goods worldwide. And they could do all of this because the container made it economically feasible.
So it opened up a whole new world of possibilities for them.
It did. And the example that Levinson uses in the book, the Barbie doll, it really perfectly illustrates this new model of globally dispersed production that the container enabled.
The Barbie doll.
Yeah, because the different parts of a Barbie doll, they're sourced from multiple countries, and then the doll itself is assembled somewhere else entirely. It's a truly global product.
And this new globalized way of making things, it meant that logistics suddenly became a much more crucial business function.
Oh, absolutely.
It wasn't just some dusty back office operation anymore.
It was front and center.
Exactly. Companies started actively managing these complex international supply chains. And they were even cutting out those traditional middlemen to further reduce costs and improve efficiency.
Yeah. And the concept of just-in-time manufacturing, where you're basically minimizing your inventory by having goods arrive exactly when you need them, that became a widespread reality.
And that was a direct result of that reliable and affordable container shipping network that had been created, right?
Exactly. It allowed companies to drastically reduce their warehousing costs and respond much more quickly to changes in demand.
And of course, this whole shift also had a profound impact on manufacturing jobs in those developed countries.
That's right. As the cost of international transport went down, those barriers to trade effectively lowered. And that led to a lot of production shifting to regions with lower labor costs.
Right.
And that's, it's a very complex issue, one with some significant economic and social consequences that are still being debated today.
And the shipping industry itself, it kept evolving, right? I mean, then came the era of the mega ships, those colossal container vessels that can carry just incredible numbers of boxes.
Yeah, and those megaships, they further drove down the cost per container. But as Levinson points out, they also created new challenges, especially for ports.
How so?
Well, these bigger ships, they needed deeper harbors and bigger cranes to handle them. So ports had to make these massive investments to accommodate them.
And then we saw the rise of those new global hubs, like Singapore and Jebel Ali, for instance. Those places strategically embraced containerization, and they became major centers for trade and logistics.
And sometimes they even managed to overcome less advantageous geographical locations.
Wow.
Yeah. And their ability to efficiently handle those huge volumes of containers, that became a key competitive advantage.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because all of this investment in deepwater ports, those massive investments, they didn't always guarantee a proportional increase in traffic.
Right, because those larger ships, they actually made fewer port calls.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they were concentrating the volume in fewer locations. So sometimes that expensive infrastructure was left underutilized.
So let's get back to the heart of what you, our listener, asked us about, that cost revolution. Levinson acknowledges in the book that it's actually quite tricky to pin down exact average declines in maritime rates.
Yeah, it's not as straightforward as you might think.
It's not, because you've got different currencies and different pricing structures to factor in.
Yeah.
It's not like there's one simple price tag for shipping something across the ocean.
No. But despite all that, the evidence really does point to a significant downward trend in the real cost of shipping a ton of international freight, starting in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which, coincides perfectly with when containerization was really becoming widespread. There was that temporary spike during the oil crisis, of course, but the overall trajectory was definitely downwards. And this dramatic reduction in shipping costs, it acted like this massive lubricant for global trade.
It did. And it's important to remember that while the cost of shipping across the ocean was plummeting, the focus on these fewer, larger container ports sometimes meant that inland transportation costs for businesses located far from those ports actually increased.
Right. So the entire logistics chain had to adapt to this new reality.
It did. But the increased competition from those independent carriers that we talked about, that really played a crucial role in keeping prices down, right?
Absolutely. They weren't bound by those old conference agreements, and they consistently offered lower rates, which forced everyone else to compete.
So more choice, lower prices for everyone.
In the end, yes.
And I think the big takeaway from all of this is that the shipping container, it fundamentally revolutionized global trade. It slashed the cost of moving goods across the planet.
Okay.
And this cost reduction, more than almost any other single factor, is really what made the complex and interconnected global economy that we know today possible.
It really is the backbone of modern globalization.
It is. So to sum it all up, the standardization and the efficiency that this seemingly humble shipping container brought to global trade, it led to a truly transformative reduction in transport costs.
Right. And that, in turn, had this cascading effect.
It did. It completely reshaped manufacturing processes, redefined global trade patterns, and gave rise to these incredibly intricate and far-reaching global supply chains that underpin so much of our modern lives and the goods that we consume every single day.
And you, our listener, asked specifically about the impact on globalization. And I think it's undeniable that this invention is one of the foundational pillars of the interconnected world that we live in today.
It is. You know, the fact that shipping costs dropped so dramatically that directly lowered trade barriers, which made it easier for goods, capital, and even ideas to move around the world on an unprecedented scale. It's really hard to imagine what our world would look like today without the shipping container.
It is. So here's a final thought to leave you with, listener. We've just explored how this one seemingly simple innovation in logistics could trigger these incredibly profound and unforeseen global consequences. So what do you think might be the next great revolution in transportation and logistics? What emerging technologies or novel approaches could once again reshape the way we move goods around the world and further alter our global landscape? And what kind of unexpected ripple effects might those changes bring? It's a fascinating area to think about as global trade continues to evolve at an ever-increasing pace.
It certainly is. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.